I call to order this hearing of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. Today's topic is the Balkans, threats to peace and stability. After the ranking member and I each take our 5 minutes to make opening remarks, each member present will have the opportunity to make an opening statement for themselves. We will then proceed with our first of two panels. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record. Building peaceful, democratic, and stable states in the Balkans has been an issue that's been close to me for many years. As I know, it's also been close to several of our friends here, especially when I hope that the ranking member might stop in, Mr. Engel, who has also been involved in the Balkans for such a long time. And I am pleased to be holding this hearing and thankful that we have an official from the State Department to take part in the hearing. As we are now at the start of a new Congress and the start of a new administration, this is an ideal time for us to reflect on the situation in the region and to recommit ourselves to playing a positive role in that part of the world. While the Western Balkan nations have achieved some major steps forward over these last 2 decades, including the independence of Kosovo, much remains to be done. Issues of governance, political development, corruption, judicial independence, media freedom, economic security, xenophobia, and reconciliation between democratic players in that region. Today, witnesses will get into specific details of the challenges and opportunities that exist in the region, but several points do appear very clear to me. First, while European integration provides a framework or end goal for the Balkan nations, that has proven to be an insufficient motive to inspire or compel political decision makers in the Balkans to do the right thing in far too many cases. Leadership from the United States remains absolutely essential. Obviously, Brussels can't hack it on their own. Second, we should remain committed to our shared values and hold the governments of the region accountable to the standards they profess. Perhaps we have been too tolerant of democratic backsliding and authoritarian politicians dressed up as Democrats. Third, at a time when foreign assistance and development aid accounts are set for reduction, they will be reduced. We need to rethink our points of influence and how we engage in that region. As an example, I'll remind the panel that I have put forward a plan for a mutual land swap, or would be more likely a border change between Serbia and Kosovo as part of a process of normalizing relations. If the Serb community in northern Kosovo wishes to be governed by Belgrade, they have every right, and we should acknowledge it. This is the same principle that led us to support Albanian Kosovars in their desire for self-determination. Border adjustments are not a magic bullet, but forcing populations to live in outdated borders or borders that are imposed upon them is a poor use of limited diplomatic resources. To help the subcommittee work through current issues and find creative solutions, we have an excellent panel of experts today. But first, we will be hearing testimony from the State Department, and certain activities of the State Department and USAID in the region have been subject to some controversy with allegations of impropriety being lodged, especially those from allegations that are actually presented by several United States senators. We look forward to the answers on those topics that have been brought up. So, Ranking Member Meeks, I'll yield to you for your opening statement, And anyone else after that who'd like to have a short opening statement? Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to provide us with a timely update on the Western Balkans region. With the EU understandably consumed by domestic politics, we must not forget the importance and delicate state of progress in the Balkans. It is an opportunity to examine the tough issues and the potential for advancement for a region that is struggling to move beyond its history, outside influence, and difficult social and economic factors. I'm especially pleased to have Mr. Lee from the administration with us today. And as I've stressed throughout my tenure on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the work that our diplomats do in the field to advance American interests under difficult circumstances is undervalued. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your service and let you know that there is bipartisan concern. Thank you for collectively for what you've done, but there's bipartisan concern about the administration's planned budget cuts to the State Department. I'm not saying this because I'm worried about your job, Mr. Lee. You think your job is okay. But I'm saying this today because I'm worried about America's place in the world and what a rudderless Balkan region would mean. The administration has not given our diplomats the tools or the human resources to do the daily diplomatic work in the Balkans. Without the appointees needed to direct the ship, the aforementioned vacuum will grow. Into this space comes the Kremlin, which exploits the troubles on the ground. Young political actors in fragile institutions are pressured by corruption, a dismayed population, and other temptation. In some cases, it is the Slavic cultural ties with the Kremlin plays. Economically speaking, easy money talks. Corrupt Russian money has brought up critical infrastructure, flooded the airways with disinformation, and hung a cloud over democracy and transparency. We are all corrupt, the Kremlin narrative goes, and the West is made out not to be any different. History has proven that democracy requires hard work, attention, and investment from leadership. In Ukraine, for example, groundwork has been laid for reform. But with President Poroshenko at the top, who is reluctant to divest from his business, the work is easily undermined. Unfortunately for us, as of late, here in the United States, we have a leader who attacks the press, threatens our independent judicial system, which undermines our democracies, demands loyalty to him over country, and will refuse to have transparency with reference to his economics. It is immensely more difficult to encourage reforms when our very institutions are threatened here in the United States. Today, European politicians are growing skeptical towards enlargement. America, one can argue, is turning inwards, and with respect to the Balkans, and this autopilot approach is damaging. It is up to Congress to support healthy, democratic, economic, and peaceful progress on the ground. The United States has invested billions of dollars and many lives in order to ensure peace and prosperity in the region. I hope that in today's hearing we can examine the broader U.S. interests in the region, integration into Western institutions. Croatia and soon Montenegro provide proof that the European peace project is alive and still very attractive in the region. Macedonia, we learned of encouraging news as a government may soon be formed that will work to protect the rights of all minorities. Nevertheless, there are pockets of trouble on a micro scale that are bubbling to the surface. Government boycotts in Albania, Kremlin-supported coup and assassination attempts in Montenegro, and worries by ethnic groups are just a few of the current events that threaten to derail peace in the region. Governments there, as well as important civil society actors and members of the press, should know that we are concerned with the state of affairs after this hearing. We look forward to following up on what is discussed at this hearing. The Kremlin's work to destabilize the situation is not going unnoticed, but I fear if we willfully ignored or welcomed by some, there will be dangerous consequences for the region as well as the United States of America. So I look forward to hearing and having a constructive discussion where we can explore what Congress can offer and do to help, because the Balkans are very important in the global world order and to the United States of America. We cannot take our eyes off the prize of working with and in the Balkans. And I yield back.
Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Meeks, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. I just returned this past week from a very useful and informative Judiciary Committee trip to the Balkans, where we visited Bosnia, Albania, Macedonia, and Kosovo. And what really struck me at the time was the central importance to each of these countries that the U.S. continue to support their democracies and their deep gratitude for America's strong presence in the region, and the danger of any retreat from our participation or engagement in the region, as Congressman Meeks just outlined. There remain serious challenges to good governance, to judicial reform, to serious economic development, and to efforts to rooting out corruption. And I was reminded during the trip of the famous words of Winston Churchill, who once said, "The Balkans produce more history than they can consume." But what was very clear to me was that after many years of war and turmoil and change, the Balkans have found a fragile peace. And I strongly believe it's in the best national security interest of the United States to continue to support reform, development, reconciliation, and maintaining the peace in the Balkans. And that this is not a time for us to retreat in any way, but to continue to understand the importance of this region, the importance of our partnership with our allies in this region, and the danger of creating space for others with less virtuous objectives. And so I very much look forward to our hearing today. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Is this working? I guess it is. All right. Our first witness is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Holt Yee, and he was appointed to his current post in the Bureau of Europe and Eurasia in September of 2013. He is a career Foreign Service officer and previously stationed in Montenegro, Greece, and most recently as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Croatia. In the past, he served as Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council, and before that, he worked at NATO headquarters as Deputy Director of the Private Office to the Secretary General. So, Mr. Secretary, if you could give us 5 minutes worth of your thoughts, and then we'll give you some questions in return.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss the situation in the Western Balkans. Over the years, Congress, and in particular this subcommittee, have played an important role in working with the countries of the region and in shaping an environment that advances U.S. interests, whom we welcome very much this partnership. Mr. Chairman, although the Balkans no longer dominate international headlines as they once did, the region still faces enormous challenges that, left unaddressed, pose a threat to U.S. interests in Europe. Ethnic tensions throughout the Balkans are once again on the rise. The recent violence in Macedonia underscores the severity of its political problems. As progress in the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue stalls, stability in the Balkans will remain vulnerable. And without needed structural reform, Bosnia is at risk of becoming a failed state. Across the region, nationalism is growing and domestic political rhetoric is increasingly divisive. From tear gas in Kosovo's parliament, to challenges from the Republika Srpska, to the authority of Bosnia's constitutional court, nationalist politicians are openly testing democratic norms and institutions. Compounding the trouble, lackluster economic growth has failed to deliver the standards to which people in the Western Balkans have aspired. In no small part, this is due to significant public corruption and endemic weaknesses in the rule of law. Even more alarming, a small number of those who do not or cannot leave are increasingly vulnerable to the twisted message of violent extremism. ISIS and other violent groups are finding success in recruiting fighters and supporters from the Balkans. Finally, Russia is increasingly working to undermine progress in the Balkans, from a bold attempt to undermine the government in Podgorica to more subtle support for secessionist rhetoric in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Russia seeks to thwart advancement towards NATO and EU membership wherever it can. Since the end of the wars in the 1990s, we and our European allies have incentivized the necessary political and economic reforms and reconciliation with neighbors by linking these actions to eventual membership in the European Union and NATO. Those linkages have been powerful and effective, but there is reason to be concerned that they are losing their drawing power as the prospects for further expansion appear to dim. It is clear that we cannot take for granted stability and democracy in the Balkans. The risk of renewed conflict is on the rise, and the forces against democracy are growing. Left unattended, the problems of the region will fester and generate conflicts that will almost inevitably draw us in. However, with active engagement, we can keep this region on the Euro-Atlantic path and manage the challenges without a disproportionate expenditure of resources. Recent history has repeatedly shown us that there is no substitute for active U.S. leadership in the Balkans and strong partnership with the European Union. Our work in the Balkans helped make Americans safer as the countries of the region have partnered with us more effectively to fight terrorism and extremism and are becoming net contributors to international peace and stability operations rather than the subjects of them. On April 21, the United States ratified the accession protocol for Montenegro to join NATO. Montenegro's entry into NATO on June 5th will be the result of years of reforms completed with assistance from the United States and other partners. Montenegro's experience provides a clear example that structural reform strengthens a country's economy and democracy, allowing it to become a better and stronger security partner and ultimately a force for regional stability. When it comes to tracking and disrupting terrorist activity, we continue to have strong, willing partners throughout the Balkans, and they need our support. Excellent regional cooperation with Macedonia, Albania, and Kosovo broke up an attempted terrorist attack against an Albania-Israel football match in Shkodër last November. These countries in the Balkans can help us, however, only if they are politically stable and the region is peaceful. We continue to work towards that end, but more needs to be done. We have also developed a multifaceted approach to push back against Russian malign influence. Our focus on anti-corruption and rule of law reforms in the region forms the backbone of our strategy. Increased government transparency and accountability counters Russia's efforts to exploit corrupt practices that make countries more vulnerable to Russian pressure. We are supporting independent media and investigative journalists through small grants and training, and are sending American experts to the region to speak with opinion leaders. In order to reduce vulnerabilities, we're promoting energy security, including through diversification. We're also using our military assistance programs to counteract Russian malign influence by fortifying the human capital of militaries of the region and presenting options that allow countries to move away from overdependence on Russian military equipment. Mr. Chairman, looking ahead, we have much work to do, but also much to build on. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify before this committee. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I have a few questions for you, and then we'll let Mr. Meeks proceed as well. And let me just ask, right now, how would you rate the peace, the basic issue that brought us into the Balkans in the first place was the peace with Kosovo and Serbia. And is that a peace that's holding? What are you expecting from that? Are you optimistic? Or are you pessimistic? Or what is your take on that peace?
Mr. Chairman, I'm optimistic about the prospects for reconciliation and peace, peaceful relations between Serbia and Kosovo. Since 2013, these two countries have been working to normalize their relations through a process facilitated by the European Union with strong U.S. support. And while the progress has been slow and at times painful, we believe it's headed in the right direction. There have been a number of agreements reached by both governments which a few years ago, back before 2013, many of us would have thought to be, if not impossible, extremely difficult. So there is agreement now on an agenda of items that were concluded, were reached agreement on in August of 2015. They're now in the process of implementing such agreements as the relations between the Kosovo Serb population with the rest of the country, and the elimination of parallel institutions. So there's no longer a Serb set of institutions and a Kosovo government set of institutions. There will be only one set. That's not to say that it will be easy to implement these agreements or that the relations will be always smooth. I'm certain there will still be more areas of disagreement and a lot of hard work going forward. But the important element that makes me optimistic is that the European Union and the United States government remain committed to helping these countries, along with other partners, to implement what they've already agreed and to go further to find a long-lasting solution.
Yeah, you mentioned about the European Union and the role it plays, but the European Union seems to be, from a distance, seems to be actually not in a situation where its power and influence is actually increasing. It looks like from a distance that it's even disintegrating back home. What is your prediction in terms of the European Union's weakening and how that will impact on the Balkans?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree that the incentive of EU membership, the drawing power of the prospect for many countries in the Western Balkan to join the European Union has weakened in recent years for many of the reasons you mentioned. However, what is important for both Kosovo and Serbia is that as they make progress on the reforms that they're being asked to make in order to become more compatible with EU standards, and as they make progress, they're given positive feedback from the EU and from us. And it is still the case for Kosovo in particular, but also for Serbia, that if Kosovo will make the steps necessary, it will gain further rewards is too strong a word, but reinforcement from the EU that they're on the right path. The example I'd use, Mr. Chairman, is on the border demarcation agreement with Montenegro that Kosovo signed several years ago, which now needs to be ratified by its assembly. The European Union has assured Kosovo that if the Assembly of Kosovo adopts this agreement, ratifies the agreement, the people of Kosovo will then get what every other citizen of Europe has, which is visa-free travel. And that is an important step forward. That is still a real possibility. So far, it's not been the European Union withdrawing that possibility. It's been Kosovo not willing, not able to take that step. And as long as these incentives are still valid, still exist, we and the European Union can still help them make these reforms.
So it'll be a positive influence. And one of the things that we've heard, and we have this letter from several United States senators, is that George Soros, who many of us believe holds beliefs that are contrary to what our country, what America is all about, and that that he has actually been very involved in the Balkans, and also very involved in the Balkans in cooperation with various American programs. What programs have we been working with George Soros on? And is that a good thing?
Mr. Chairman, first, as a general statement, I want to say that recent stories, accusations about the Open Society Institute and Mr. Soros himself playing an outsized role in the Balkans are greatly exaggerated. And what I want to make clear to this subcommittee, this committee, is that the efforts by the United States government, by the European Union, are their own. In other words, we're not on the influence of any one person, any one institution, not Mr. Soros or anyone else. Rather, it's the other way around, that individuals and NGOs and other organizations are supporting what the European Union and the United States government have been promoting in terms of advancing the types of reforms, whether it's rule of law, fighting corruption, strengthening free media, strengthening independent judiciary, strengthening civil society. All these efforts are efforts that are led primarily by the international community, by the EU and US, where we've seen support from open society over the years, many years in the Balkans, has been particularly in the area of strengthening civil society, of citizens and citizen-led groups to become contributors to stability, contributors to the reforms that we believe also are important. So there has been some cooperation. There has been, both from the EU and there has been from the United States, some support to open society over the years in promotion of certain projects, but at a much smaller level than many people would be led to believe by some of the narrative that's circulating now about this disproportionate influence by Mr. Soros.
So you're confirming for us that indeed there has been cooperation with George Soros's projects, but they have been exaggerated in terms of the influence that Mr. Soros's organizations have had.
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Meeks, you may proceed.
Thank you, and Mr. Secretary, again, welcome. Let me ask, and I think you touched on this in your remarks, that the Kremlin exploits weaknesses in the region, and we know that when we have ethnic tensions and economic malaise and high unemployment, lack of transparency, lack of a free press, and even the stalled progress toward the EU, that leaves a lot of space for the Kremlin to act. So my question to you is, what do you think are the Kremlin's goals in the region, in your humble opinion?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for that question. It would be very difficult to predict or to read the mind of Vladimir Putin, but I can say that it seems to us that the efforts most recently in the Balkans by Russia tend to be aimed at increasing influence of Russia, tend to be to discourage the countries of the Western Balkans from advancing towards the West. Western institutions, whether it's European Union or NATO, tends to be to, as much as possible, create greater dependency of these countries on Russia as opposed to on the West. So there does not, in my view, appear to be a kind of grand strategy, rather an opportunistic approach at how to weaken certain governments that may be favorably disposed towards the West, to help governments become, if possible, more dependent or more friendly towards Russia. And of course, there's a commercial motivation behind a lot of what Russia does as well, to, for example, in the energy area, to increase the dependence of Europe and including the Balkans on Russian sources of hydrocarbons.
Thank you. Well, let me ask the opposite question, too. We have a new administration here in the United States. So what would you say is, in our engagement, what's new in the United States engagement? Is it something new? Is it the same as in the past administration? Are there any differences or any changes in our goals? That's why I'm delighted to have you here, because we're trying to figure that out. And unless we have individuals like yourself, we don't have anyone to ask. So I'm trying to figure out what are our goals, or the administration's goals, and whether they've changed, they're different. If they're different from the prior administration, what are they? And please, give me an answer to that.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, for that question. U.S. policy in the Balkans, for good reason, I believe, has been consistent over the last several administrations, going back at least the last 2 decades, where I believe all of the administrations, the United States administrations, have focused on protecting and advancing U.S. interests in the Balkans, a very volatile area, an area where there has been considerable instability. Our interests are supported by the sorts of efforts that you mentioned, sir, in your opening statement, as well as the chairman, that it is very important for the United States that the region be peaceful, it be secure, it be stable, that elements, sources of instability, whether it's corruption or malign influence from Russia, are dealt with firmly and swiftly. We believe that continues to be the interests of the United States, to continue helping the region advance towards integration with the rest of Europe, to stronger institutions, to closer partnerships with the United States, helping us in areas such as fighting terrorism, dealing effectively with mass migration flows, and also reinforcing operations or exercises by NATO. So I think the consistency in our policy is based on the consistency of American interests in the region.
Because I'm, concerned, because, our president has said different things about NATO. Once it was irrelevant, maybe it's relevant again. Different things about the EU. And when I talk to some of our allies, they're confused also. And that's why and our president has said he knows more than any of our State Department, our intelligence folks, or anything of that nature, and that he was going to review and change everything, because even though 2 or 3 past administrations, Democratic and Republican, he says they all were wrong, that no one is smarter than he. And so I want to be sure that we're staying on the same path. And there's not been any indication or any order to change the direction, because I think, the region is interested in wanting to be secure as what the United States is doing, because too many places, folks don't know. And you're telling us that they're going to stay the course. All right. I think we're going to do another round, right? I can give this
If you'd like. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Secretary Yee. I want to just follow up on Mr. Meeks' last set of questions. Have you had discussions with Secretary Tillerson directly about the administration's strategy toward the Balkans? And can you share with us, if you have, how our thinking about the Balkans relates to our strategy in the larger region?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I have not discussed directly with Secretary Tillerson our strategy in the Balkans. However, I can assure you that much of what I ever described in my testimony has been thoroughly circulated and vetted, reviewed by the senior levels of the State Department. And we have, of course, kept Secretary Tillerson informed of our activities, of our plans, and particularly since the Secretary has participated in meetings with NATO allies, that he had to decide whether to sign or not to sign the protocols of accession of Montenegro for NATO membership, and also to advise the President that he is well aware of the importance of the region. And I believe as we have more time, we will be able to.
Okay. I understand that. I just want to be sure that it would be helpful to know if the Secretary of State has actually discussed directly with you the administration's strategy about this area in the region. I take it the answer is no. The second thing I just want to follow up on Mr. Rohrabacher's question. The reference to the Soros Foundation was actually made on our trip as well, and of course it turns out it's a very modest participation, and it's through a competitive grant process. And I want to just ask you whether or not there is any difference in your mind in the work that is supported by the Soros Foundation and the National Endowment for Democracy or the International Republican Institute, those agencies that are doing work on governance, judicial reform, rule of law, strengthening civil society. Is there any difference?
Is there any, sorry, sir, is there any difference between the approach before and the last administration?
No, the work that's being done by the Soros Foundation in those areas, aren't those the same kinds of things that are happening with the National Endowment for Democracy and the the Republican Institute?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. The type of work that we support, U.S. government supports or European Union, is supported through implementing partners, which are selected according to open and transparent criteria, which include a wide range of organizations, including those that you mentioned, sir. The Soros Institute, Open Society Institute, actually makes up a very small percentage of the assistance programs that are supported by the U.S. government and also by the European Union, as far as I know. The types of criteria that the non-governmental organizations, including Open Society, need to meet are consistent across the board throughout the Balkans.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And also, would you just tell us a little bit about what your assessment is? There have been proposals of very substantial cuts to foreign assistance to the Balkans, and how that might impact the U.S.-Balkan relationships, and what are the both short-term and long-term national security interests of the United States, if those, the level of cuts that have been proposed by this administration, what the impact would be?
Thank you for the question, sir. The State Department is confident that it will be able to carry out the foreign policy priorities set by this administration within the budget blueprint that has been put forward by the administration.
With a 37% cut in foreign assistance?
We will, as always, sir, make the absolute best.
Well, I guess the question isn't will you make the best. Will it have an adverse impact on the work we're doing in the region, the partnerships that we are building with these governments to promote transparency, rule of law, judicial reform, good governance, and to combat the growth of extremism? Because if it's not having any impact on it, we maybe shouldn't spend any money there. I mean, that's clearly not the case. So are you saying that a proposed reduction of 37% will not have an adverse impact on the work we are doing and the long-term national security interests of the United States?
Well, sir, I'll make 2 points on that. First, of course, there's an impact. If we spend less or we spend more, there is an impact because our implementation of programs based on U.S. assistance, we do believe has an impact. So there will be. But
And
the
it
question
will
on
be a
whether it
negative impact.
Well,
If there's a nearly 40% cut, that would not advance the national security interest of the United States, in your opinion.
Well, sir, I would say we would have to see what the impact is going to be based on our prioritization and our focus that will be a necessity after we receive the budget from the Congress.
Well,
But
you're
the
not
point-
suggesting we're going to have greater influence and be a better partner in the region if we spend 40% less resources devoted to the work.
Well, sir, I'd make this point, that U.S. leadership in the impact of American diplomacy is, of course, reliant in great part on our assistance, but is by no means the only means through which we have an influence on the region. Much of what we're doing today in places like Macedonia and Albania are not dependent on the amount of dollars that we put into our programs, though again, we of course consider these programs to be very helpful. What is important is that these countries, the populations, the citizens, the parties understand that the U.S. is committed, is willing to demonstrate the leadership necessary in order to help them solve problems, some of which of course do require resources, but some require leadership and a willingness to stand up to authoritarian leaders, corrupt leaders, organized crime, narcotics traffickers. Many of these efforts depend on U.S. leadership.
And
diplomacy.
resources.
And resources.
Okay. I just want to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by welcoming Ambassador Faber, who is here, who had the pleasure of meeting in Albania, and I want to welcome her to the hearing room. And I'll yield back.
At the request of Mr. Meeks, we will have a second round. And let me just ask right off the bat here, are we, what you're describing is, of course, that the United States is deeply involved. When you have a democratic election in countries like this, does that mean that we are trying to superimpose what we believe would be the best government in a democratic process? Are we telling people that their democratic process is important, but here's what you should be doing because that's our opinion? Isn't that what these Soros operations are all about?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. We are absolutely not imposing our will or our preferences for one party or one policy.
But we are interfering, are we not?
I would not.
Wouldn't say that giving money that goes into helping one party organize this group of people or that group of people, even though it's not on election day, that's not interfering with them?
I would say it's not, sir. It's not going, first of all, the assistance does not go to one party or one group of citizens. It's distributed in a way that is nonpartisan, that is supportive of civil society or other sectors of society.
So nonpartisan is an idea that one party believes in a set of ideas, and it just happens to be that we're helping those ideas, promoting those concepts through whatever nonprofits that we have there, that isn't considered helping the party that's advocating exactly those things and hurting the party that's advocating another direction. That seems to be interference. In Macedonia, we have some pictures up here, and I will find out exactly what they're about, but a majority was elected in Macedonia, and the reports that we have are that our ambassador actually encouraged a situation in which the Macedonian government, rather than having it the majority, the party that won the majority take over, we have been encouraging obstructionism and some kind of coalitions to try to make sure that the party that won didn't actually take power. Is that an accurate assessment?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. No, it's not an accurate description.
Okay.
Actually, quite the opposite took place. Let me begin with the first part, just to make clear on interference. There's no question that the United States is assertive in defending U.S. interests and what we believe should be accepted by countries that want to be partners with us. And this is important to mention that Macedonia wants to join NATO. Macedonia wants to join the European Union. And the same with Albania also wants to join the European Union. We as partners are trying to help them meet the standards necessary in order to achieve that goal. So when, for example, we advocate for rule of law, when we advocate for judicial independence, when we advocate for human rights, it is not always popular to the government in power. But we believe as partners and as potential allies, it's important to make clear and to help them implement reforms that will advance what we believe is a shared interest. But if the government does not want to support rule of law, does not want to support human rights, it is their sovereign right to do so. It is still our obligation to make clear what our priorities are.
As long as the government is representative of an election process, that they are the real government, whoever.
Absolutely.
We believe the majority of people will decide who is the government. And if we are there undermining that for whatever reason we want the government to go the opposite direction, we are interfering with people's right to choose their government. And we've heard Mr. Meeks is very concerned about any influence the Russians might have. Okay, they have their national interest, we have our national interest, but perhaps it's better for us. I mean, what the result that I see in Macedonia is that, and I use some not totally accurate words when someone asked me about it. They got quoted all over the world, but they don't have, and I should have said a country, they don't have a government. I mean, they don't have a government because there's been people there from the outside, I believe, who's convincing people not to either respect the majority or, number two, not to make the compromises that are necessary for democratic government to work. And if we're down there watching out for our interests, and we have decided that that's tied to social goals that may or may not be what the people there believe in, we are interfering with with that system to the point that it's totally broken down. And you don't have, correct me if I'm wrong, the government right now, they still have not have a functioning government in Macedonia. Am I wrong?
There is an interim government, sir, to answer your question.
An interim government, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But to answer your question, in Macedonia, the elections did result in a situation in which no one party had a majority. And therefore, it was incumbent upon the parties to form a coalition that would have a majority of seats in parliament so the government could be formed.
Was it a majority of the vote or a majority of the people elected in the parliament?
It was proportional,
Did-
so
did-
it was essentially the same, that the party,
So no party won a majority of the
no
vote?
party won a majority. However, there was a coalition of members of parliament that did represent a majority that is supposed to receive, under normal European democratic norms, a mandate from the president of the country to form a government. And up until today, the president has been withholding that mandate from the majority. And we have been advocating very strongly, sir, for the president to observe the Constitution, observe European democratic norms, along with our European partners.
Okay, so we have been suggesting that the president send that letter and make that recognition. Is that it?
That he allow the formation of a government, not one party or the other, but to give the mandate to the majority. This is the basic democratic principle. And today he did that. So we've advanced beyond the next step out of this crisis.
Seems to me that this has been going on for a while now, and it's only a little country, and we do have, as you say, a lot of influence in that part of the world, and quite frankly, I think that we've screwed it up, and I'll leave it with that. Mr. Meeks?
Well, I just say, you know, we always talk about the United States being a leader and try to protect and make sure that there's human rights. So we're not trying to force a government to do something, but I think that if we see where human rights violations are wrong, we should challenge the countries on their human rights. When we see there's not freedom of the press, we should challenge the government on whether or not there's freedom of the press. When we see that there is corruption, we should challenge the government on those corrupt issues and not just look away and say that's the will of the people, because clearly when you have certain leaders the will of the people is not heard because it's the will of the leader, and they prevent the people when you suppress freedom of the press, when you suppress humanitarian rights, when you use certain tactics. And I think that still is a very good role for the United States of America to play. Fact of the matter is, we talk about Russian influence, you know, I want to challenge them. I think that the President of the United States, when he had the foreign minister in the White House, as opposed to talking about secrets that we had, he should have been questioning Russia on human rights, on freedom of the press, on various things. If we shouldn't want to be like them, I think that we set the standard, and we should be the ones that are moving forward in that regards. And let me, a couple of quick questions. You said in your testimony that of secessionist rhetoric in Bosnia, you said it was being leveraged by the Kremlin. How so?
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, for that question. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, particularly in the Republic of Srpska, there is a strong interest and efforts by Russia to maintain and increase its influence with the government of the Republic of Srpska, both through financial means and also political means. Where we have seen the malign influence in Russia in particular has been in encouraging words of encouragement, what we're aware of in public at least, and we can only imagine in private, encouragement by the Russian Federation of the secessionist plans and movement by certain politicians to break away from Bosnia-Herzegovina, which would be in violation of the Dayton Accords, which we believe would be tremendously destabilizing and would undo many years of hard work in stabilizing Bosnia-Herzegovina and bringing it towards the European Union, and if it decides to NATO as well. So our efforts in Republic of Srpska and Bosnia in general are to strengthen institutions which will make it more difficult for Russia or other external factors who wish to maintain a malign influence, including by strengthening rule of law, by strengthening the free media and strengthening the judiciary, independence of the judiciary, so they're not able.
Let me ask another question, and I don't know, maybe they're doing good things, maybe they're checking human rights, et cetera, but back in 2012, the Russians and the Serbian governments established the Russian-Serbian Humanitarian Center, I think it was in Nice. The Russian, and that was founded in order to provide humanitarian emergency response in Serbia and other Balkan states. How do you assess that arrangement and the activities that are going or working with the Russian-Serbian Humanitarian Center in Serbia?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Meeks. We believe it's very important to be vigilant in general about all Russian moves in the region, since we've seen recent moves by Russia which are undermining the interests of the countries of the Western Balkans and also of the United States, we believe. Most recently, most dramatically in Montenegro, where the Russian government attempted to undermine the elections and the government itself in Montenegro. It's very important to be vigilant. I think we have some questions about why Russia is trying to set up a humanitarian, quote, humanitarian center in Niš, and why it is seeking special status for this facility. We don't believe the intentions are pure, and so we're advising Serbia to ask the hard questions, to ask Serbia why it needs this facility, why it needs to have a special status, and what it's going to do that it can't already do from Belgrade or from existing facilities.
Let me make one last question. Well, answer is a statement, but you might want to answer it. It's, you know, piggybacking off of Mr. Cicilline, because you spent much of your testimony on incentives driving countries in the region toward better behavior. But now, if we have these severe budget cuts, aren't you going to gut the very incentives which could help countries move forward? Because a lot of the incentives, you know, it takes personnel costs money, as well as other things, and you won't be able to maintain with a 40% cut personnel as well as other areas. And so therefore, a lot of the incentives that we have been giving out with a 40% budget cut, where even a general said that if you cut the State Department, we're going to just spend the same money in bullets. But isn't that contrary? Wouldn't we be losing out on those incentives? to move forward?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. There's no doubt, as Mr. Cicilline also made clear, that the resources that are used in providing assistance to countries of the Western Balkans is important and has had a positive impact. And whether we spend more or less, there will be an impact. The point I want to make in terms of the incentives for the region are that the assistance, in terms of the financial assistance in particular, are not the most important drivers. The most important drivers are the types of reforms these countries need to make, the help, political help, especially these countries need to make these reforms. So, for example, a lot of the countries in the region actually are led by people who do not want to see the country join the European Union or to move forward, because they're invested in the status quo, invested in systems that allow them to exploit state-run enterprises, to maintain control over all the instruments of power in their countries. So it is somewhat of a paradoxical situation in which we are trying to convince the governments which tell us that they want to join the European Union, that they need to make substantial changes in their political system, in the way of doing business. And these, of course, these processes, these reforms are assisted by our programs. But the most vital element is the political will necessary by the leaders in these countries to move forward to make these changes.
I'm out of time, and I just want to thank you again for your service. I always think that those who work for the State Department are underappreciated. I think that this budget proposal to the State Department shows that underappreciation. I think that I know, you've got to stand there and take the weight here, but it's not gone unnoticed about the service that the men and women of the State Department do on an everyday basis. When we travel and we go and we see what's happening on the ground, and we see how you serve our country, I salute every person that's in the military, but I also salute every person that's in the State Department, because I see members of the State Department putting their lives on the line. And just as we need to increase, and they're looking at ways to increase the defense budget to some degree, we need to make sure that we do the same thing with our State Department, at the very least maintain it, because your job and your work is something that is of tremendous service to the United States of America, and I thank you for it.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. And now, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin just to respond a little bit to the chairman's suggestion that our foreign policy should be indifferent to values, that there's something wrong with supporting an effort in a country where there's a particular party that is supporting one set of ideas versus another. Because if you imagine that there were one political party that were supporting free press, judicial integrity, good governance, the respect for human rights, free and fair elections, and there was another entity that was supporting repression of human rights, judicial corruption, corruption in the election system, violation of human rights, our foreign policy ought to reflect our values as a country. We're not indifferent to those things. We've come to a conclusion as a country that we will promote peace and stability around the world and the long-term national security interests of the United States by encouraging things like respect for human rights, honest elections, good governance, judicial integrity, free press. And the notion that we sort of should be indifferent to that would mean we wouldn't have any foreign policy that reflected our values as a country. And so I think in the Balkans, it's particularly important to reject the notion that it doesn't matter which of those values are being reflected, because it does matter. And I think in the issue of Macedonia, I heard from our ambassador directly about the efforts to encourage the application of the mandate and the forming of a government. I'm delighted that news happened today. But that's exactly the role the United States should play: respect for rule of law, respect for fair elections, and to be supporting the governments and the countries that are doing that work. So I think it's important to push back on this notion of indifference in our foreign policy. I think that is exactly, sadly, what we've heard from the Secretary of State a little bit, and I think it's a very dangerous direction. And so I'm happy to hear that you understand the importance of that. One thing that we heard from everyone that we met with in the Balkans was how important EU accession and NATO membership was. And I just want to hear from you, Mr. Secretary, about how you think those objectives play in the kind of long-term national security interests of the United States, the deep interest in all of the Balkan countries to be part of the EU and to be part of NATO.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline, for those remarks and also the question. Fortunately, the Western Balkans still believe very strongly in American leadership, still believe very strongly in the importance and value of joining the European Union and joining NATO. The facts speak for themselves that countries that are in NATO, in the European Union, are more prosperous, they're more stable, they have better futures for their young people. And so it continues to be a draw. And as Chairman Rohrabacher mentioned, as the prospect for joining those institutions weakens, the motivating force we have in part weakens. So we need to continue, I think, to keep these processes moving forward, both as we can encourage the European Union to continue the European project, but also to keep NATO's open door open. That has been tremendously important in helping Montenegro, Albania, and Croatia motivate themselves and their populations to make some difficult reform steps. And if I could just make one short comment on the issue of values. The Secretary of State, Vice President Pence, Secretary Mattis have all made clear to their staffs that values do matter, that human dignity, respect for human rights, for justice, rule of law, and democracy are all the important ingredients that bind us and Europe together. So I think there is high-level support, although it may not have been articulated directly with respect to the Balkans. I believe that our leadership has made clear that the values do matter and that we should be fighting for them.
And my last question, Mr. Secretary, is if the United States were to pull back in a significant way from our engagement in the Balkans, do you believe that we would see a greater likelihood of the spread of extremism and a rise in terrorism? And if so, in which countries do you think the risk is greatest?
I believe it is, thank you for the question, sir. I believe it is a risk if the West turns its back or appears to be turning its back on the Western Balkans, that the countries of the Western Balkans will look for other options. They'll look to either Russia or China or other powers that are providing alternatives to the first option, which is the West for most of these countries. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we continue to help them make the reforms needed, including in the areas you mentioned of fighting extremism, providing jobs for young people who otherwise will turn to less appropriate uses of their time and energies. If we don't do this, then I think we can fear that things will deteriorate, not only with respect to violent extremism and terrorism, but with regards to the economy, which, if not improved, will lead to mass migration outside of the region into Europe, but also to the United States. And if brain drain increases in that region, the problems of these countries will only get worse.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And Mr. Chairman, I would just ask to associate myself with remarks of Mr. Meeks with respect to our men and women in the Foreign Service. I am always in awe of the tremendous service of of the men and women who serve our country all over the world, sometimes in very dangerous places. And this was no exception on my trip to the Balkans. We have extraordinary professionals that have dedicated their lives to representing our country in the interests of the United States, and they do it with tremendous dedication and make us all very proud, and that includes you. So thank you for your service, and we'll do all we can to protect resources for the important work that you do. And with that, I yield back.
I'd like to now welcome the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Engel, who has had decades-long interest in this region, and I know because we came in together and we were both very active since day one, and a man who I deeply respect, and very happy that he stopped in and joined us at this hearing today. You're recognized, Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those kind words. We have worked together for a long, long time. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Ambassador of Albania to the United States, my friend Florida Faber. She's here. I want to recognize her and thank her for coming. And of course, I want to welcome our Deputy Assistant Secretary Hoyt Yee, who works so hard and so long. Hoyt, it's always good to see you, and I'm grateful for working so closely with you through the years, and thank you for your service. I agree with Mr. Cicilline about how we are in awe of people in the Foreign Service that work so hard on what I consider a shoestring and do such wonderful work. So if we take away a message, one message from today's hearing, it's that our work in the Balkans is not over. The project that began in the 1990s with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia still requires active engagement by the United States and by our allies in Europe. First, the good news: there's been real progress in the Balkans. 2 countries, Slovenia and Croatia, have joined the EU. 3, Slovenia, Croatia, and Albania have entered NATO, and a 4th, Montenegro, is on the way. That's good. Since the brutal wars of the 1990s, peace and democracy have indeed been the norm in the region, but all is not well. The democracies established with each country's independence are now fraying on the edges. Press freedoms are narrowing in Serbia. Macedonia has not yet been able to form a government, although today I hear there's real progress. And Albania's opposition Democratic Party is refusing to take part in next month's parliamentary vote. Kosovo's elections next month, spurred by a parliamentary no-confidence motion, seem relatively normal in comparison. But Kosovo's troubles remain right around the corner as Serbia remains unwilling to normalize relations and recognize its neighbor, Kosovo. On top of the regional concerns, Vladimir Putin has added Balkan countries to the list of targets where he's stoking tension and undermining confidence in democracy. The Kremlin attempted a coup in Montenegro, which fortunately failed. It is selling advanced weapons to Serbia, including MiG-29s and T-72 tanks, and it's getting involved in Macedonia's domestic politics, aiming to prevent a resolution to the governing crisis in Skopje. So, Hoyt, I'm glad you're here to help us understand what's going on and what the United States is doing to get the region moving forward again. I'd like to make a few points. First, President Trump's State Department and foreign assistance budgets will devastate America's ability to promote our interests and protect our security. This is as true in the Balkans as it is anywhere else. Since the wars of the 1990s, we have invested billions in the Balkans, and we have made progress. It would be foolhardy at best to squander that investment simply to further an ideological drive to make deep cuts throughout the government. Secondly, I was taken aback at the initial United States opposition to Kosovo's plans to form an army. If our recognition of Kosovo as a sovereign and independent democracy means anything, it means we must stand by Pristina when it pursues policies well within the bounds of what's accepted for any other normal country. And saying Kosovo's development of a military should take place gradually just doesn't cut it anymore. Kosovo is in its 10th year of independence. We're past gradual, we're now approaching glacial. Rather, let's help the Kosovars consult with their domestic constituencies, their neighbors, and the international community so that they can formally establish their non-threatening defensive force. Once again, Mr. Chairman, our work is not done in the Balkans, as you well know. We need to keep the region on the path towards democracy and the rule of law. We need to continue to integrate the countries in the North American community, and we need to ensure that Europe's soft underbelly does not become a low-hanging fruit ripe for Putin's picking. This means that the United States must step up our engagement in the region and support each nation as it continues its path forward. Anything less will risk bringing further instability and difficulties back to a region that deserves a real chance at freedom and prosperity. So I guess I'll just ask you to comment on anything I said or might say, and I also want to ask you about the name Macedonia with Greece, though problems there. Have there been any changes or thawing in terms of the name for Macedonia?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for your statement and your questions. I agree largely with everything you've said, sir, with one possible clarification I wanted to make about Kosovo and its military. We do, in fact, support Kosovo's aspirations to create an army. We have agreed with Kosovo since 2011 on a strategy, the security sector strategy review that includes a number of steps that Kosovo will undertake before it transforms its security force into an army. That strategy includes having on board all of the parties in the country, and the government also, including the minority Serbs. The Kosovars have agreed that for reasons of stability, it would be much better to have all of the different peoples in the country supportive of this step before it happens. So what we're asking for is for Kosovo to follow the strategy that we've laid out and agreed together, that Kosovo honors its commitments to its partners, because after all, Kosovo is, while it is a sovereign country, also has the presence of a NATO-led peacekeeping force, KFOR, which expects Kosovo to meet its commitments. So in other words, if Kosovo is going to take any step that will possibly affect the conditions for the NATO-led peacekeeping force or for security in general, these steps need to be coordinated in advance. And where we did make clear to the Kosovars we thought they needed to return to the strategy was when it appeared a couple of months ago that Kosovo was going to proceed with formation of an army outside of the framework of the agreement that had agreed with us and with other NATO partners. So we do support formation of an army, but it should be in accordance with the strategy that we've already agreed with them. And it should be done in a way that does not upset the security situation, which might lead to a weakening of support from NATO allies for the Kosovo Security Force, the KFOR, the peacekeeping force led by NATO. And in general, on Russia, I just want to add again what I mentioned earlier, sir, that we believe it is very important to stand up to Russian malign influence, and we are engaged in many different efforts to strengthen the ability of all the countries in the Western Balkans to resist illegal or ill-intended efforts by Russia to increase its influence, including in Kosovo, including in Albania, in places which have traditionally been more or less thought to be immune from this kind of influence, and now we're beginning to see where it could, in fact, be coming into play.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if you didn't just indulge me, I would like to ask one more question and say that I'm deeply concerned with the lack of justice for murders and crimes committed by the government of Serbia during and after the Kosovo War. There have been no charges brought against anyone for the murders of the 3 American citizens, the Petici brothers, despite widespread understanding of who was behind them. On January 31st of this year, the respected Humanitarian Law Center of Belgrade released a dossier called The Cover-Up of Evidence of Crimes During the War in Kosovo, the Concealment of Bodies Operation. This report described mass graves in Serbia containing the bodies of 941 Kosovo Albanians, mainly civilians killed outside combat situations in Kosovo during 1999. According to the report, quote, the evidence corroborated that the decision to conceal evidence of crimes committed was planned as early as March 1999 at the highest level of the Serbian government. And on top of this, Belgrade has not brought to justice those responsible for attacking and setting fire to the U.S. Embassy in 2008. I want to know when Belgrade will face facts and bring to justice the people, including high officials in its government, who are behind these very serious crimes. The murder and mass burial of almost 1,000 innocent civilians is a crime against humanity, but the perpetrators have since gone unpunished. At the same time, the European Union has looked the other way and has been willing to proceed with Serbia's accession process. This has to stop, and stop now. Until Serbia brings those who have committed these crimes to justice, the EU should not move ahead with Belgrade's accession, and the United States should think twice before advancing our relations with Serbia. I also think that Serbia should stop throwing roadblocks in Kosovo's way, in Kosovo's attempt to join the European Union. If both of them are to join the European Union, and I have no objection to that, ultimately, then I think that each should help the other join the Union, not resist and make it almost impossible by throwing roadblocks. So I would like, Mr. Chairman, to have unanimous consent to put in the record HLC's one-page summary of the dossier I just mentioned, and I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your years of service on this issue and your focus all of these years. And I don't think it's due to the fact that you have massive numbers of Serbian or Kosovar residents in your district. I got to feel it's just from your heart and representing a truly a principled position. So, which, however, bam, here comes the other shoe. I may disagree with certain things about. Let me just note that my,
Well, we've disagreed on a number of things, Mr. Chairman, through the years, but I think mostly we've agreed.
okay, let me just note that my name, or not my name, but my positions were mentioned in several testimonies, and as a matter of courtesy, I will yield myself some time to respond. First of all, and again, I would hope that, in my disagreement with Elliot, is that I would hope that we close the books on that war, and and Serbia starts cooperating with Kosovo and bringing up the who killed who 35 years ago or 30 years ago is going to be harmful to bringing about that cooperation. So I would recommend both sides just drop it, close the book, realize bad things were done, and try to form a better relationship. In terms of our influence, let me note that several times what we've heard here today is how we must be concerned about Russia's, we have to stand up to Russia's trying to increase its influence. What is that all about? I mean, this is Russia-phobiaism. Russia-phobia, they are no longer the Soviet Union. They are a major power. They have every right to try to expand their influence by influencing people in various parts of the world, as we do. And we are all over the map in these things, and we are our military all over the world, trying to do that through the military even. And yeah, Russia has every right to try to become an influential force, especially on countries that border Russia. What's going on? I mean, we went up to the Baltics, and after hearing the words Russian military aggression in the Baltics over and over and over again for a year, I went up there, and then we had a hearing, and there was no Russian military aggression in the Baltics. I mean, not once has their troops gone into one of these countries, and we actually put more troops on their borders than they actually put inside their own country next to these countries. So again, I think this idea that we are now treating Russia the same way we did during the Soviet Union is harmful to peace and undermines our ability to get things done and promote peace in the world. One last thing about this whole thing about Macedonia and Soros and these other things. Look, and here's where we disagree. No, if a country decides they have political parties based on their social norms, whether it's, they have a right to have a political party and say, no, we are not going to, and I'm not stepping on trying to attack anybody here or anything. We have a right to determine what we consider to be acceptable in our national parade, okay? And I know we have had problems with that. What I see is that you have Christian groups in these countries that Soros and his gang don't like the Christian groups. They don't like family groups, people who have more traditional conservative principles. Now, I'm not saying those principles are right. I'm just saying the people of these various countries have the right to do that without interference from us, without us shipping in money to try to help them organize politically to get the guys who are on the other side of those social norms. And finally, let me just say that when we're talking about what really is the motive going on here, who's seeking influence about what, Mr. Secretary or Deputy Secretary, what we're going to call you today, my read of this is that what we have here is the same sort of thing that we've seen with the EU elsewhere, like what they did in Ukraine. It's a power grab by suggesting any country who wants to get into the EU has to do this, has to jump through hoops. The attempt at control isn't Russia. The attempt at control is that we are backing up the EU's demand for controlling this part of the world. And that's what their goal is. And every time and unfortunately for these folks, I would say that the EU is not proving to be as viable as it presents itself. And I think the EU is going down, and instead it's using its leverage based on us to try to get these new governments down in the Balkans, to get them to toe the line that they create for that European market as they see it. This is German bankers basically telling the Balkans what to do. And I'm sorry, I see that far differently than the Russians, as far more of a detriment to freedom than I do that the Russians are trying to gain influence on this or that legislature or this or that leader in that part of the world. However, I will, as a courtesy, give you 1 minute to refute it, then we'll go on to the next one.
I just was going to ask unanimous consent that Secretary Yi may have an opportunity to respond so that it's clear to anyone who's watching that what you've just articulated is not the policy of the United States.
You got it.
So maybe Secretary Yi could clarify that. We actually do, I think it's important. I've traveled with the chairman and we've had this lively discussion before, but I think since we have an administration official here responding to the administration's view of that would be
I
useful.
learned this about Macedonia too. You don't want to anyone to determine that they think you're talking for the United States government. I'm not even talking for our new president.
Or a majority of the members present today.
All right, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mrs. Celine. Very briefly, I just want to say I agree with the chairman that sovereign countries should have the right to decide. And this is perhaps where we disagree, sir, that it is an assessment of the United States government that countries like Macedonia and Albania and Bosnia-Herzegovina and other members of the Western Balkans want to join the European Union, want to join the West. They want to join NATO.
Yes.
In order to do that, there are certain standards they need to meet. Rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for free media, freedom of the speech.
How about economic policies they have so demand?
Also certain economic standards. So what we are doing is helping them to achieve their goal. We're not telling them they must join NATO or they must join the European Union, but they must meet certain standards if they do want to advance. Russia is fundamentally against what these countries are trying to do. That is the difference. We're trying to help these countries join the West. Russia's trying to hold them back.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Secretary. We appreciate you coming here. And let me just note that we will be having a CODEL to the Balkans this summer. And we are all invited to go. And we hope maybe even to see you there or at least get a briefing before we go. And we are watching this situation very closely. And it seems to me that what we had for so long over the years, all we've heard is the Baltics, again, the military aggression in the Baltics. And we didn't hear anything about the Balkans. And the Baltics, as we find out, in terms of Russia, it's a locked door. They're not going through the Baltics for seas. But the Balkans seem to be a broken door. And whichever way people are going to go in and out right now, it will be determined by what we do as a nation and what we can do to help those people there have a more efficient, effective, and free government. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We will now call on the second panel. Would you like to have an opening statement for this panel? Oh, you sure you don't want to say anything more? Are we happy to? Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, God bless. Well, I got it all out. Now comes the response. It reminds me of when I was in Afghanistan. We lobbed a whole bunch of these 150 millimeter rockets into a Russian position. And then this Afghan guerrilla leader comes to me and says, and now we can expect their reply. All right, here we go. Gordon Bardos and Jody Guardia. And all right, Is called to order. We are grateful that we have a fine panel of witnesses. I would ask the witnesses, if they could, to provide 5 minutes worth of oral testimony. Anything you want to put in the record will be put into the record, but 5 minutes, and that will give our panel, our committee members here, a chance to go into a dialogue about the points that you've made in your 5-minute remarks. So first is, I will introduce all of them, and then we'll start with Mr. Bardos. After that, Gordon Bardos is president of the Southeast European Research and Consulting. It is a political risk analysis firm specializing in Southeastern Europe. He previously served as director for the Association for the Study of Nationalities and as a linguist for NATO-led stabilization forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Joseph DiGuardi, no, I should know that after all our years. I've been mispronouncing it every time I see him for the last 30 years. A former member of Congress, a member of this committee, and while in office and later as a prominent Albanian-American leader, he has worked tirelessly to focus the attention of the American government on the Balkans. He is responsible for helping bring about the first congressional hearing on Kosovo in 1987. Today he is president of the Albanian American Civic League. And finally, Mr. Daniel Serwer, who is an academic director of conflict management at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a scholar in the Middle East Institute. Previously, he was a minister counselor at the Department of State, serving as U.S. Special Envoy and Coordinator for the Bosnian Federation. So we have some people who have got experience on the ground and a great deal of knowledge to share, and we appreciate you joining us. Dr. Bardos, you may proceed.
Now? Better? Okay. The current crisis of Balkan democracies, the dangers inherent in opening a Balkan front in the new Cold War, the need to improve the economies of the Balkan states, and the challenge of confronting Islamist terrorist groups in southeastern Europe. Just in the 2 weeks since this hearing was scheduled, 2 Balkan governments have essentially fallen. And overall, as one European diplomat has noted, 2 states in the Western Balkans are on the verge of disintegration, and 3 are in deep political crisis. International democracy monitoring organizations, such as Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, all agree that democratization in the region has either stalled or backslided over the past 10 years. I was going to do a glance around the region, but I think Secretary Yee already did that, so there's no need for that. I'll concentrate on something else. In the midst of all of these troubles, most people's attention is focused on what Russia is doing in the Balkans. I want to argue that this obsession with Russia in the Balkans is as misguided and potentially as detrimental as the discussion about WMDs in Iraq was, because turning the Balkans into another front in the new Cold War will sacrifice democracy in the region for yet another generation. By almost any measure, military, diplomatic, and economic, the US and the EU have achieved dominant positions in southeastern Europe. To give just 2 examples, and more provided in my written testimony, every country in southeastern Europe is currently a member of NATO or a member of the Partnership for Peace program. Russia currently has formalized military alliances with none of the countries in the region. In 2015, Serbia conducted 2 military exercises with Russia. In the same year, Serbia conducted 22 military exercises with NATO. To sum up my argument, I would use a sports analogy. In the game with the Russians in the Balkans, we are leading by 78-13. Some people think we need to keep on running up the score. I would argue that it would be better for us to call this game and start preparing for the challenges posed by next week's opponent. Viewed in this context, the challenge presented by next week's opponent is going to be stabilizing and strengthening the Balkans' failing democratic institutions and resuscitating the region's stagnant economies. To put the economic situation in the Balkans in some perspective, the states in the region have gone through an economic depression that has lasted far longer and cut far deeper than anything the United States experienced in the 1920s. In 2015, Serbia's GDP was still 25% below what it was in 1989. According to the World Bank, Bosnia currently has the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. And of course, the Greek debt crisis is still far from over. Unfortunately, promoting the Balkans' democratic and economic development will be impossible if the region becomes yet another front in the new Cold War. Finally, we need to address a serious problem in the region that I believe is getting insufficient attention: the growth and spread of Islamist extremist movements. Thanks in part to the work of Saudi, Qatari, Iranian, and other groups, a militant form of Islam has been steadily encroaching on the region's traditionally more mild traditions. Albania, Bosnia, and Kosovo are estimated to have produced more jihad volunteers per capita than any other countries in Europe. The importance of the Balkans in the international jihadi movement is also evident from the frequency with which a Balkan connection can be made to almost every terrorist incident in Europe. The Balkans also play an important role in the European terrorist threat matrix as a source of armaments. Thanks to the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s and Albania's near meltdown in 1997-1998, jihadis can obtain practically whatever weapons they might want in southeastern Europe's black market arms bazaars. What should be of particular concern is the degree to which Balkan militant Islamists can, or have, established ties with southeastern Europe's flourishing organized crime networks, which are amply skilled in human trafficking and drug and weapon smuggling. Indeed, given the current state of the Balkans, it would not be difficult to put together all of the elements needed to make everyone's nightmare scenario, terrorists acquiring nuclear weapons, come true. At least 3 times over the past 5 years, the FBI has helped to thwart efforts to sell nuclear and radioactive material in Moldova. We've been lucky so far, but the combination of weapons-grade uranium on the black market and apocalyptic terror groups with known ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons should be a loud wake-up call to everyone concerned. To deal with all of these problems, we need to make several adjustments to our policy towards the region. First, we need to align our political ambitions and political projects more closely to the region's political culture and political tradition. Far too often over the past 20 years, we have been engaged in political and social experimentation that simply will not work in the Balkan environment. Second, we need to start entertaining the possibility that the stability versus democracy trade-off might be a false dichotomy. A strong argument could be made that leaders and groups that believe they enjoy Washington's favor or believe they know how to manipulate American policymakers will increasingly press their advantages against both domestic and foreign opponents, resulting in less democracy internally and more aggressive policies externally. Third, we need to spend less of our diplomatic time and energy on micromanaging states and more on organizing a coordinated and coherent approach to the region by major powers such as Turkey, Russia, and of course the EU. Whether we care to admit it in the current political atmosphere, each of these actors will be needed in promoting stability and peace in the Balkans over the coming years. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for inviting me to share some thoughts with you on the situation in the Balkans, with you and the committee. I've discussed all of these matters in more detail in my written testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were here 2 years ago. You had a wonderful hearing, and it was mainly on Kosovo and Macedonia. And you could see the photo all the way to the, it's being blocked by the fellow from Voice of, excuse me, Chair, could you move, please? There is Mr. Ziadin Sela with you 2 years ago, being greeted after the hearing up there, surrounded by his family and friends from where he was the mayor of Struga. He was announcing that he was now going to embark on an impossible task of reforming, politically reforming the state of Macedonia. 2 years later, it was Ziadin Sela and his party that was able to meet the qualifications of the mandate. And
under the Constitution, as bad as that Constitution was, and under European law, naturally, he had to be given by President Ivanov the right to form a government after the ruling party, under the strongman, Mr. Gruevski, was not able to. So you were right in your comments before. He was able to get a coalition of parliamentarians, Slav and Albanian, to be a majority and form the government. When he was supposed to form the government on September 27th, look at the result. There he is in a hospital bed. Right below, you'll see his face bloody. He's being pulled out by a thug. And just to show you how big these Slav thugs were that were hired by Mr. Gruevski, take a look at this right here, the guy with the beard. He's one of them. That was the beginning of the melee. What happened on the 27th was Gruevski's attempt to be sure that there would be no reforms, that there would be no new government, because he knows how high his crimes are and he's afraid to be prosecuted and put in jail. So he must keep control. So what you heard today is like we heard from Mr. Milosevic so many times when we were able to get hearings here. The day of the hearing, they released prisoners. They did this, they did that. So just today, because our Civic League has advertised this, has told the world that this hearing was going to be really important for Macedonia. And in this room, I dare say that 90% of the participants are ethnic Albanians from Macedonia whose families are still there suffering. They came from, one from Alaska, many from Chicago, 2 from Iowa. They're here because they wanted to show you their concern, just the way the Kosovars did many times when we had those hearings. But look at this. Now, he's being pulled out here. Look at the blood on his face. He was given up for dead. Now, the only reason he's in that hospital bed is that there was a security guard, the only Albanian hired by the Macedonian government to show you the economic discrimination in this country. That Albanian security guard realized that he was not dead. He was still breathing. They walked away from him. He took him and put him in a room, hid him until the place cleared out. Then he was delivered by an ambulance or an armored car to the hospital. His doctor, Ziadin, couldn't come here. He wanted to be here, but I was naive in thinking he could. He's had so many concussions. If you look at the picture, you're not just seeing dry blood. You're seeing pummeling, constant fists to the face and to the head. They were there to kill him. They advertised this weeks and weeks in advance that this man was an enemy of the state. It reminds me of what Milosevic called me, an enemy of the state. They called him an enemy of the people. This is a signal to UDBA or the security forces to eliminate that person. And that's what they tried to do on September the 27th. They went 2.5 hours. They put the uniformed police outside. They only came in after 2.5 hours when they thought they had beat up everybody and killed Ziadin, only to find out that he was put in the hospital, resuscitated. His doctor, Arben Taravari, Arben, stand up just for a minute, is right here. He flew in. He's a neurosurgeon. He had operations. But for one day, he said, I have to come here and at least take Ziadin's place and let people know that this man is going to come back and reform the government. So what do you make of today? This is not going to continue. Whatever Ivanov did, it's not going to last. It's too dangerous for Gruevski to have a new government. You have to remember, Mr. Chairman, 20,000 audio tapes were made public by the Slav opposition of Mr. Gruevski, Mr. Zaev, whose party now, I think it's LSDM, is in coalition with the party of Ziadin Sela. He is not going to allow that coalition to go forward because he knows everything's been publicized. The only answer to Gruevski to those wiretaps was, where did they come from? Some foreign thing? He won't deny them. And you can't believe what some of these wiretaps say. It also, I mean, what they say are things like those Albanians that we set up in this Matza case, and you know what? They have long jail sentences. They couldn't adequately defend themselves. They were set up. They were not even guilty, but now they're in long prison sentences. You have Komnova, when they set up this phony operation and called it the Albanians from Kosovo coming into military action. They were actually hired by Slavs to do that for an excuse to go further in their opposition or their repression of the Albanian people. Where did this all started? You said that the country of Yugoslavia disappeared, disintegrated 1991, 1992. Somehow, the government of Macedonia slipped in with no opposition as an independent state in 1992 with an old-type constitution under the former Yugoslavia. And when they formed the state, it clearly says, this is a state for Macedonian Slavs. They don't mention Albanians, they don't mention Bulgarians, and by the way, there's no majority in this state. 1/3 Bulgarian, 1/3 Albanian, and 1/3 Macedonian Slav. That's the kind of state it is. But the Albanians have practically no rights whatsoever. 5% or less of the Serbs in northern Kosovo have much greater rights, including language rights, than probably 40% of the country, let's say at least 35% of the country in Macedonia. So what's here for Albanians? We should have had a solution to this 16 years ago to stop the violent conflict between the Albanians in Macedonia and the Slavs. We guaranteed with Europe something called the Ohrid Agreement. 16 years have passed by, and things have only gotten worse because Gruevski, like a racketeer the way he is, he co-opted the junior Albanian party that put him into office, and nothing's been done. So one of the recommendations I'm going to make to you is that we have to go forward with the State Department, the U.S. taking a much more active role in a framework to implement the rights of the Ohrid Agreement. We must get that constitution changed so that it codifies the fact that you have at least 2 major ethnic groups in this state that need equal rights, because there's nothing like equal rights. You talk about the economic discrimination and the political corruption against the Albanian people, it's monstrous. And just economic discrimination. Many jobs are given out in the government. If you have 33%, and they were supposed to get up to 25 or 30% on the Albanian side, they haven't hit 10. It's around 7%. No jobs. The unemployment rate must be just like, what's going on in Bosnia right now, the highest in Europe.
Joe, you've of course.
May I put on the record, I've just summarized my comments. I'd like to
Whatever
put
you-
my full testimony
extraneous,
on the record in writing. I'd like to then put the interview by the person who saved Zidane Seller, the Albanian security guard. I had it translated from Albanian to English. I want to put in some of the photos you haven't seen, because when he was here 2 years ago, he also met with Senator McCain, and hopefully that'll be done by the doctor before he goes back. And I want to put on the record this statement that I put on the record in 1991 when Chairman Pell was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and 1998 when Senator Biden was. It's the expulsion of the Albanians by Vaso Trubilovic, 1937. This paper is the modus operandi of the Slavs and the Serbs. They want to get rid of all Albanians. I've quoted it in my testimony. I want to put the entire document on the record so you can see they're not going to give up on this. And 2 articles, sir. One from Mr. Faure, one of the...
Joe, without objection, all of that will be put into the record.
Okay, thank you.
You did get twice as much as everybody else.
Thank you.
Mr.
Appreciate it.
Server?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Meeks. With permission, I would like to submit a written statement for the record and use a few minutes for just 3 key points. First, the countries of the region made remarkable progress in the 10 years or so after the NATO intervention in Bosnia in 1995. But in the last 10 years, these past 10 years, the U.S. effort to pass the baton of leadership to the European Union has allowed slippage. In Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, and Macedonia, there are now risks of instability that could trigger a region-wide convulsion. That would reflect badly on America's global leadership role, unravel 3 peace agreements, and cost us far more than conflict prevention. Second, those who say ethnic partition through rearrangement of borders would be a viable solution are playing with matches near a powder keg. Moves in that direction would lead to violence, including ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. It happened in the 1990s, and it could happen again. Mono-ethnic states cannot be achieved without a massive and expensive peacekeeping deployment. Ethnic partition would not only be violent, it would also generate a new flood of refugees and creation of Islamic mini-states in parts of Bosnia, Kosovo, and Serbia proper. This was a main reason we refused to move borders in the 1990s. Americans should be even more concerned about it today. The Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have had more success recruiting in the Balkans than many of us thought possible given the pro-Western and pro-American attitudes of most Muslims in the region. Reducing Balkan Muslims to rump monoethnic states would radicalize many more. Damage would not be limited to the Balkans. Russia would welcome ethnic partition because it would validate Moscow's destructive, irredentist behavior in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, Crimea, and Donbass, as well as give Moscow a stronger foothold in the region. It would also leave a geographic gap in NATO and the EU that we have long hoped would be filled with friends and allies. My third point is this. I see no serious alternative in the Balkans to the political and economic reforms required for each of the countries of the region to be eligible for NATO and EU membership. All want to join the EU, which unfortunately will not be able to begin admitting them until 2020 at the earliest. That leaves NATO membership as the vital carrot for reform, except in Serbia. We need to do more to enable Balkan countries that want to do so to join the alliance, as Montenegro is doing right now. Let me summarize what this really means. In Macedonia, it means Europe and the US need to tell Greece the FYROM will be invited to join NATO once it reestablishes transparent and accountable democratic governance. In Kosovo, it means ensuring Pristina develops an army designed for international peacekeeping that poses no threats to Serbs. For that, Serbia will need to accept Kosovo's sovereignty and territorial integrity by allowing UN membership. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, NATO members should tell Republika Srpska secession will gain no Western recognition or aid for it or any country it joins, including from the IMF and the World Bank. These and other suggestions in my written testimony would put the region back on track and prevent the peace agreements of the 1990s and 2001 from unraveling. So too would ensuring that all Balkan countries have access to energy supplies from countries other than Russia. Natural gas from Azerbaijan, LNG from the US, or eventually Mediterranean gas from Cyprus or Israel. Mr. Chairman, I've just outlined a substantial list of diplomatic tasks. If the administration commits to them, implementation might require an American special envoy. But a policy should come first, one based on maintaining current borders, preventing ethnic partition, and pushing hard for NATO and EU membership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think we get the Golden Cup for being right on time. Okay. I will start the questions, and then we will move from there to Mr. Meeks. Mr. Bartos, you're the first time, you have used for the first time the words that I know would eventually emerge. The words, the new Cold War. I don't know who wants it, but somebody wants war with Russia. I mean, it's more than just a fear of Russia. Somebody wants there to be a new Cold War. I have spent a considerable part of my life trying to defeat the Soviet Union, and both in the White House and out in the field against Soviet troops, etc. And I started anyway, when I was a teenager. But the bottom line is that we don't want a Cold War. The American people don't want a Cold War, yet we have an unrelenting hostility that says that we have to watch out for even Russia's influence on a region. I see no reason why Russia shouldn't be able to sell energy to any country that it wants to, or if any country. I don't see that as a hostile act in the United States. Let me just note, if we're going to solve this, we got to do this. We got to move forward in a positive way, rather than looking at this as some kind of we're going to do this so to screw the Russians. That's not going to be bring about a better world. But we know something needs to be done in the Balkans because it's not working. And just like you said, Doctor, that when the EU took over, basically some of the major leadership from the United States, things started going haywire. And it's continued to go haywire for the last 10 years. So with that, why not make a different kind of approach rather than having us, as I say, I think that what's motivating us is there are some very powerful moneyed interests in Europe that want to see the Balkans towing the line that they dictate. And what about having a new, now put this up for the panel, what about having encouraging these countries to form a new Southern European Economic Union together? And anything beside, they can't call it Yugoslavia, they can call it whatever else they want to call it. The bottom line is that if you had a open borders type of free trade with these countries, it would be a tremendous benefit to them. So instead of us pushing to try to get them to do whatever the German banks tell them to do in order to get into the EU, maybe we should be telling them, why don't you start working together and opening up trade between each other and tearing down these boundaries, economic boundaries. What do you think about that? Please, 1 minute. Start with Bardos. Sorry, no, start with the doc. Start with Joe in the middle, and then go to the right. Go ahead.
It's not going to work, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Let me tell you why. You've got such political corruption now in Albania, in Macedonia, in Kosovo, in Serbia. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The people are not being served by these governments. I don't know what's going to happen after the elections in Kosovo and in Albania. Nobody agrees on anything, apparently. I think that it's time for the U.S. to realize that by abandoning the Balkans to the European Union, we have failed. Oakwood Agreement was guaranteed by the U.S. and by the European Union. It did nothing. It's worse now than it was before. So how could we look at normal ways of thinking to create an economy in Southeast Europe?
Got it, Joe, but now tell us your 30-second answer of your plan.
Well, the
Joe's
plan,
plan.
the plan is, and I hate to see these cuts for the State Department, it doesn't make any sense. We need to be much more engaged than we are. We're fooling ourselves.
What are we pushing for?
Well, for instance, get Oakwood back on. It was signed off, but let's have an implementation framework that we are monitoring very closely. Not saying, well, let the European Union do it and we'll figure out what goes on later. So we got to take baby steps. This is not going to be solved very fast. The racism that exists from the Slavs to the Albanians is so great because of the paper I just mentioned. How we got to get rid of the Albanians at all costs. Basically, that's what that paper says. And that's one of the reasons why Milosevic went to The Hague, because we brought him to The Hague and made sure that paper was put on the record so that they knew Albanians could never coexist in Serbia and in Kosovo with this kind of thinking. And now Gruevski's doing it in Macedonia. So I don't know what the answer is.
Okay, well, let's go to the doctor who may know the answer.
Mr. Chairman, I won't claim to know the answer. What I'll tell you is that it's worth a look. I think we have not maximized the economic advantages of peace after
And cooperation.
after 1995 and 2001. These countries do have good access to European markets through their stabilization and association agreements. I think they have quite a bit of access to each other's markets as well. But that's a proposition that would have to be studied in some depth and with some care, and I frankly haven't seen such a study. Maybe, Gordon, you know.
Thank you, Dr. Bardos.
Well, it's a very commonsensical and logical idea. As a matter of fact, the current Serbian Prime Minister, soon to be President Vučić, proposed something like that a few weeks ago, a kind of a Balkan common market. The problem with it, I think a lot of the problem with it right now is political. Emotions are still too raw among the different peoples in the region. Some people think that Serbia would wind up dominating such an arrangement, and they don't want to see that happening. Some people think it might be like a recreation of the old Yugoslavia, and they don't want to see that happening. I think there is something in place, and unfortunately I'm not an economist, so I don't know this in great detail. There is something called CEFTA, the Central European Free Trade Association, or agreement. I can't remember all the specifics of it. Something like that does exist. I think a good step in this direction, though, would be to start promoting what might be politically possible, is to start promoting as many bilateral free trade agreements as possible. Start opening up the markets that way. So maybe, obviously, it might not work between Serbia and Kosovo now, or between Kosovo and Macedonia, but you could see something, you could see trade freeing up, considerably between Serbia and Bosnia, for instance, or between Croatia and Bosnia, and
Well, we know
various permutations
you know,
like that.
We know something has to happen. The bottom line is you have people suffering there economically. You have young people who have no hope of jobs.
Right.
You got people who when people lose hope, they turn to extremism. And the last thing we need for whether they're Christian extremists or whether they're Muslim extremists, we do not need them turning to their religion and becoming extremist and then joining in with others to commit acts of violence. And that's a real, not only a possibility, it's already been in your testimony, you mentioned that's being seen now for the not first time, but we're easing into a situation where that didn't exist, and now it's becoming a part of the reality of the Balkans. So we need to get moving, we need to be engaged, and I will have a very short closing statement, but Mr. Meeks has the floor now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again. Interesting dialogue. Let me just pick up where some are talking about, and I know I'll start with Dr. Sewer. In March of 2017, this year, the leaders of Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia met. They all got together to, I guess, reignite this regional cooperation and reaffirm their shared interest in eventually joining the EU if possible, and putting forward a plan for the Western Balkans. And I think they planned another meeting sometime this year. I think it's July. So my question to you is, do we, the United States of America, should we have an interest in these meetings continuing? Are these meetings a positive step that may lead to something or towards mutual cooperation? And if you think it is, how do you think the United States should support such meetings?
Mr. Meeks, I'm under the impression the United States has given ample support to these kinds of regional arrangements, which exist among the defense ministers, among the interior ministers, and also for regional, especially regional economic and infrastructure cooperation. There's very little progress on regional infrastructure. The EU has promised a lot of money, but hasn't really started the digging yet. I'm under the impression that we've provided a lot of diplomatic support to those efforts. We don't have the kind of bilateral assistance money that helps much in this game. We frankly have been out of the infrastructure game for the most part. We need to see the World Bank in particular, but also the European Union picking up the bills for roads, for railroads, for airports in the region. But I think it would have been better to ask Mr. Yee, but I think he would say, look, we've been fully supportive of all the regional cooperative arrangements, and they are quite successful, I must say. These guys meet all the time.
Mr. Bartles, you mentioned that the new Serbian president talked about having a Western Balkans custom union or something of that nature. I think you mentioned that. Is that a good idea? Was that something that would help some of the economic instability in the region? Is that a step in the right direction? And what influence do you think that the new president of Serbia will have in the region?
It is a very good idea. It's, you know, as I said, very commonsensical, very logical. It would reduce tariff barriers, make transporting goods easier, moving labor, capital, and so forth. It could be a spur to economic development and activity in the region and so forth. But again, you know, the problem right now at this point is political. I think there's too much, as I said, the emotions are too raw right now. People are still very leery about anything that looks like recreating Yugoslavia. And there's also the fear that this might be, the Europeans might be offering this in place of European Union membership. So that's what a lot of people in the region are afraid of too, that they're not, you know, okay, the Europeans have given up on taking the Western Balkans into the EU, so this is kind of our consolation prize. So you're getting a little kind of political and emotional pushback because of that as well. But it's a very good idea.
You agree?
When you mention Vucic and Dacic, you're talking about the people that were weaned by Slobodan Milosevic, the biggest racist you're ever going to find. What he did, he got convicted. Well, he died in his prison cell because he didn't take his heart medicine, but he's about to get convicted for war crimes and genocide against the Albanian people. What did Vucic and Dacic say recently? That they signaled that they will definitely come in to support Gruevski, the guy that did this. And what they want is an ethnic thing. They want an excuse. They want to see the Albanians out so badly that they want to see an ethnic, even though it's a political conflict and an economic problem, they want it to be inter-ethnic because that would draw Russia in, and then Russia would probably support, obviously, the Serbs, and it would be, again, a war against the Albanians. So we got to be very careful here.
I mean, my last question, I see I'm just about out of time, and I know we got votes getting ready to come up. My other concern is Bosnia, and its current troubles with its ethnic minority population, of course, and the corruption and its relatively weak central government. How can we encourage others in the region, the regional actors, to better cooperate and to support an independent Bosnia? I think that is real important. Is there something that we can do? Is there a role that we can play to help make that happen? Dr. Sewell?
Yes, in short. We should be encouraging Belgrade to do what it has any number of times said it would do, which was to be supportive of a sovereign and integral Bosnia. But much more is needed because we have in Republika Srpska somebody who has promised an independence referendum, who clearly is in violation of the Dayton Accords. We've designated him under our treasury regulations. And we need to do more to ensure that he is not a dominant political force in Bosnia, if Bosnia is going to stay in one piece. The way to do that, in my view, is to talk with the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans have to be willing. When we designate somebody using the Treasury's powers, the Europeans, more often than not, do not follow suit. They use those tools much more sparingly than we do, and that has to do with politics inside the EU. We need to be getting them to follow suit. I think preventing some of Mr. Dodik himself and some of his people from traveling in and using the financial system of the European Union would be a very serious sanction. So I think Serbia is ready in many ways to do the right things, but it's Europe that hasn't done as much of the right things that I would like to see. frankly, Bosnia is a problem because of the constitution that we wrote for the country and that they wanted for the country. And it's very hard to change that constitution, but I have no doubt but that we will be having problems with Bosnia until it at least has a clause in its constitution that says the central government has the authority, all the authority it needs to negotiate and implement the rules of the European Union. That would be my simple solution in Bosnia.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you for your testimony. I'm simply out of time here, and I know that we have votes coming up, and the chairman wants to do his closing remarks.
There you are. And
I wanted to make a comment on that. Can I make
Well-
just one quick comment, please?
oh, yeah,
on
sure,
that?
Joe.
You can't trust Serbia. Mr. Dodic is taking his orders from Belgrade. Serbia wants, at some point, not only to have influence in Serbia, but to make it part of Serbia. The same thing that's going on in northern Kosovo. So, and listen, Serbia still has not recognized Kosovo. They want to become part of the European Union. Part of that was good neighborliness. What good neighbors are Serbs to Kosovo and Albanians? They've gotten worse, not better. So you got to watch out for Serbia. They're the bad man in the neighborhood, and you're not going to get them to change anything because the issue is not greater Albania, it's greater Serbia.
Last bit of testimony, watch out for Serbia.
Yes.
Look,
Am I right?
well,
Ask the Albanians.
look, my theory is watch out for bad guys.
Well,
And
bad
listen,
guys
there
everywhere,
are good people in every one of those ethnic groups that you're talking about.
Right.
There are good people
You're right.
who are Serbs, and there are good people who are Albanians. There are good Muslims. There are good Christians. And what we have to try to do, if there's going to be peace, is try to seek out the good people in
Right.
all of those communities and say it's about time we get moving. We have stagnated enough. We have 20 years of going nowhere
Right.
because we're only concerned about the bad guys over there, and we're there with all the bad guys. The fact is that there are bad guys, as I say, in all of these countries, but there are good guys, and the good guys, I think, are capable of working together if the United States provides leadership. And we have to provide leadership with people knowing that we care about things, but like that, when you have people being beaten up, like we care about that, and we have to be forceful to let people on the other side know that is unacceptable. And we also have to have some creative approaches. And let me just say that this idea, I don't know, every time I've gone down to the Balkans, they seem to have the same concept. Let's get a part. We got to get part of the EU, and we got to be part of NATO. Well, this is like I really got to get to the Titanic before it sails. And in fact, the Titanic's already sailed. I'll pay you to put me on the Titanic. Get me a rowboat or get me a motorboat and get me on that ship. The EU is the past, and it's not working. If we can come up with some positive solutions and have some energy and some excitement about really economic coalitions that work, let's look back when things were really bad. And I can tell you, there are really bad guys in Germany in World War II, and we came along with the Marshall Plan. I've read about the Marshall Plan. I haven't, probably some of you, probably the doctors a lot more than me, but the Marshall Plan, what did it do? What was the most important thing it did? Is it made sure that all of these inhibitors to trade between their countries, the European countries that had been at war with each other, they got rid of those impediments. And they encouraged people to economically cooperate. That's what made the European situation better in the first place. None of that's been tried in the Balkans. None of it's been tried in the Balkans because, and I will tell you, Joe, if a lot of Serbs are bad, there are a lot of Germans that were bad at that time, and we made sure that we integrated them and into a situation. And now, of course, they're calling the shots on the World Bank and a lot of other places.
Mr. Chairman, you made a very good point. The people are good. It's the governments that are bad. How do
Okay.
you deal with
All
these
right.
corrupt governments? That's
Well,
the problem.
It's up to us to make sure that we're encouraging the good people, and I don't know, we do respect democracy, we do respect who gets elected and the rules of the game, and let me just say, this committee will continue its, we paid a lot of attention to the Baltics, and as I say, as we got in the Baltics, I did not find the Russian military aggression everybody was talking about, and we spent a lot of time in this committee going over Turkey, and Turkey has turned out to be the disaster that we thought it might be. This subcommittee has held numerous hearings with numerous ideas going into this, and I can assure you that now we're going to be focusing on the Balkans to try to come up with ways that we can actually work with people there, the good people there in all of these countries, try to find some cooperation, some areas of cooperation, and make it happen. And so with that said, you can count on, this is just the second of a hearing, of a series. We are going on there will be a CODEL, a major CODEL, just to the Balkans, probably in August. And we will visit these areas, and we would really be happy to any advice that any of you could give us as to who we would meet with there. With that said, I want to thank the witnesses and thank Mr. Meeks. Got a good one again. And this committee is adjourned.
Thank you.